Okay, so lecture 6.3 this week is about alternate economic models, and alternate to what we're traditionally taught about growing up and what we're familiar with, because it's alternate to the economic model of capitalism and the economic model that drives our current economy. And it's definitely alternate to macro and microeconomic concepts that we are taught at university and that our businesses tend to function on currently. So by the end of this lecture, we're going to be focusing on specifically in this lecture on one alternate model of economic development referred to steady state economy. And so by the end of this lecture, you will know what a steady state economy is compared to a capitalist economy or any other type of economic model of an economy. You'll also be able to sort of explain in terms of if we're going to achieve sustainability, why a steady state economy might be what we need, and then the steps necessary to achieve a steady state economy. So two key terms in this lecture that you are probably currently unfamiliar with, which is steady state economy and degrowth. So the problem. We have grown up learning, if you haven't taken micro and macro yet, you will, and in those courses you will be learning sort of these traditional neoclassical approaches to economic growth and economic development and economic policy. Most governments now in the 21st century have economic growth as their primary policy goal. Everything is about the economy and driving the economy and making the economy bigger. Well, unfortunately, there's a fundamental conflict in most instances between economic growth and environmental protection, and in a lot of senses, protection of human rights as well. We are at a point where economic growth, there's a lot of evidence out there to show that economic growth as the primary policy goal is no longer working to improve people's lives, particularly in the developed world. In the developing world, of course, there is still some economic growth that needs to happen in order to improve people's lives. But what we know from evidence and from a lot of analysis is that even if we continue to grow the economy here in the developed world, we're not going to see much difference in standards of living and improvements in people's quality of life and their happiness levels. So that's the problem. So what is economic growth? Well, this is what we're taught. When we take a macroeconomics class or microeconomic class, this is what you learn. You may have already forgotten if you've already learned it, or you will yet to learn it. Basically, in a neoclassical economic sense, we define economic growth as any increase in our economy in terms of the production and consumption of goods and services. So economic growth happens in a country or globally when the population increases and therefore consumption increases, or the amount that we consume per person increases. So those are the two ways that we can see economic growth. Here in the United States, we have as we've learned, a relatively stable population. Our population isn't growing significantly. As a result, the primary way that here in the US we achieve economic growth is by increasing how much each person consumes. It's typically measured using the gross domestic product, the GDP, which we learned about in our last lecture, which is the total amount that we are spending in our country on all goods and services that are produced. And even though this is our dominant policy goal right now, that most governments in the Western world and even in the developing world are striving to achieve, it's not been always that case. In fact, it's a relatively recent economic policy goal. So if you look historically and sort of back calculate GDP, you'll recognize that it really wasn't until around the 1900s that we starting to see this increase in economic growth. Prior to that, governments and kings and presidents and rulers were pretty happy with sort of a steady state, which then during the Industrial Revolution, we suddenly see this drastic increase in economic growth. And then by the middle of the 1900s, you see this shoot up of growth, just skyrocketing economic growth. And the question is, how long can this continue? How long can we continue to grow the amount of products and services that we are consuming as people without it destroying our planet, essentially, right? So if you think about this in the terms of what we've been learning about all semester, and the relationship between our economy and the environment. In order to make money, in order to make goods and services in this world, we have to put resources into the system. Those resources are used to produce goods and services, and then what comes out of the system is waste. Well, every time we push for more economic growth, we increase the amount of goods and services that are flowing through our economy, but that also means that we are increasing the amount of resources that are going in and the amount of waste that's going out. And we already know from all of those various calculations that we've been doing this semester that we are overshooting our ecological footprint. We are producing way more carbon than our atmosphere can absorb, and we are overshooting water consumption as well. So we already know that there is a limit to growth, and we have overshot that limit essentially. So we cannot continue to just grow our economy, because at some point it will end up in very negative consequences for the planet. So we've already looked at the ecological footprint. You guys all have measured your own ecological footprint. What this is showing and what this is new is the correlation between ecological footprint and a country's GDP. So it's, I think, hopefully by now pretty intuitive that a country's ecological footprint correlates positively with its GDP. So as a country's GDP increases, so does that country's ecological footprint, because raising GDP generally involves putting stress on resources and on waste disposal. So here we see a plot of GDP and ecological footprint data. And the correlation is about what you would expect. It's a pretty linear, positive relationship. So that implies two things to me. The first is that every time a country's GDP goes up or down, its ecological footprint will go up or down. So that when a country increases in prosperity, it adds to the world's environmental problems. And the second sort of thing that this implies to me is that, and probably what's more important to grapple with, is that reducing a country's footprint, which I think we kind of recognize needs to happen, will be very difficult to do while also increasing a country's GDP, which currently is a primary political policy of our government and most governments, is to increase GDP. And what I'm pointing out is that you can't have both. You can't protect the environment and reduce our ecological footprint while also increasing our GDP. We are currently in a state of overshoot. We know this as well. We are using resources faster than which they can be regenerated, and we are producing waste faster than they can be cleaned and cleansed out of our environmental system. We reached overshoot in the mid 1980s, and we have just continued to increase that since then. So this scatter plot that you see on this slide is the number of Earths you currently need if everybody to meet everybody's needs. And you can see that in about 1985 was when we were within the capacity still. So is it all worth it? Well, I suppose we could argue that it is worth it to be an overshoot if it means that we are happier and healthier people on this planet. Well, interestingly enough, we know that there actually is not a positive correlation between happiness and GDP. So a couple slides back, I had a slide up there that showed you the correlation between GDP and ecological footprint, and it was a nice straight up positively correlated scatter plot. When you do similar plots of measuring GDP and happiness values within a country, you can see that they are not correlated. So there's all sorts of different ways that we can measure happiness. There's happiness scales, stress scales, various different things. And you can see that it will, here in the United States, for example, we have the green line, which is income, not GDP, but personal income. And you can see that as personal income increases, for a while, happiness also increases. And then we kind of hit this breaking point at which happiness plateaus, and then income keeps going up, but happiness doesn't go up in any greater values. And this is over time, plotted in over time. On the scatter plot on the right, this is by country, and you can see all the various different countries. And there is some initial correlation between happiness and GDP. So people who live in poorer countries are near the bottom left side of this particular scatter plot. And as their income increases, their happiness does tend to increase to a certain point, and then it levels out, it plateaus. So there's very little research. There's a lot of research to show that people who live in Canada really aren't any happier, for example, than people who live in Colombia or Venezuela. Basically, that coupled with the fact that we have been pushing economic development and economic growth as a policy for the last 50 plus years, and it has had very disappointing results. We haven't been able to solve issues with poverty, even with our own country, let alone in other countries. We also are continuing to see human rights violations, infant mortality rates, things like that, that would suggest that perhaps this push towards constantly trying to grow our economy and increase consumptions of goods and services is not necessarily the most positive policy priority, and perhaps we should be looking in a different direction. And so I put this slide here as a way to say, but there is still sunshine in the storm, and that we can still perhaps get to a point where we can achieve economic development and happiness, and see people's happiness increase as they're also developing economically. And so people who are arguing for these alternate models, economic models, one of the most dominant ones that sort of you see most prevalently discussed is this idea of a steady state economy. So instead of always trying to grow our economy and increase production, increase GDP. The argument behind a steady state economy is to get to a point where we can maintain the GDP of a country and be able to meet everybody's needs and have economic equity, but do it within the carrying capacity of our planet. And so that's what this idea of steady state is. So instead of trying to get to a point where you're just continually seeing the GDP up in a country, you get to the point where it levels off and it stays at that steady level. So what is that? Well, there are sort of some primary characteristics of a steady state economy. These are things that have to occur within a country or in a society in order for a steady state economy to exist. First of all, you have to have a stable population. You cannot have increasing population size and expect to achieve steady state economy. You have to have a stable per capita consumption. That means that I have to stabilize how much I am purchasing, how much I'm consuming in terms of goods and services on an annual basis. I don't have to increase it. There has to be a reduction overall globally of energy in and materials in and waste that's coming out of a system. And we have to have constant stocks of both natural capital, so like our water supplies and things like that, as well as human capital. So sort of that's what is a steady state economy, is an economic system where these things are happening. Characteristics of a steady state economy: everything is at a sustainable scale. It's a scale that we could continue well into the future, 100, 200, 300 years. There is a fair distribution of wealth. That does not mean we are advocating within steady state economy for socialism or communism where everybody gets the same thing, but rather looking at what is fair in terms of how wealth is distributed within a country. Efficient allocation of resources, so that we are looking at our systems and saying, how can we efficiently allocate food, water, energy, things like that. And then a high quality of life. There is some misnomers out there that steady state economy means that we're going back in development, that we're going back to, the 1800s. No, that's not the case. We are trying to determine ways in which we can have a very high quality, very rich life without causing long-term detrimental damage to our earth and our other people and our economy even. So how do we do this? Well, the first thing is that there's two things. We have to adopt the right macroeconomic goal. So currently in the United States, the macroeconomic goal is to grow our GDP, to grow our economy. People who are advocates of a steady state economy would say that is the wrong macroeconomic goal in order to achieve sustainability. We cannot achieve sustainability and pursue continuous GDP growth. Instead, we have to adopt the goal of a steady state economy. So that's the first thing. That's the first thing that has to happen. The second thing is to gradually change existing policies that are promoting growth towards policies that promote a steady state. And economists and political scientists and social scientists and psychologists who advocate and promote a steady state economy all would agree that this has to be a gradual change, but it has to be intentional. So the government has to say, this is what we're doing, this is our goal, and then come up with a plan to gradually work towards that. So step one of all of these gradual changes would be to limit resource use. Currently in the United States and most of the developed world, we have actually very few controls by our government on how we use resources and how we emit pollutants. Now, you would think, listening to our current political arguments, that there are all sorts of controls and regulations. That is not the case in the United States when you compare us to other countries, and it's particularly, even globally, it is not the case when you really think about what controls need to be out there. So in a steady state economy, there would be much stricter control, government control, there would have to be, on resource use and how much emissions could be emitted in a year. So it says here there would be imposed emission caps. These would be government, maybe intergovernmental, so multiple countries come together to put these together and say, this is the amount of carbon dioxide that you can emit per year. If you go over that, you will be fined or you will be shut down as a company. The other thing, another way to do this would be to employ what's called a cap, auction, and trade system. And this actually already exists. It's already happening, but it's a way to use sort of macroeconomic policies to allow companies to trade and sell emission allocations. So if I, as a company, have I've been told that I can only emit X amount of carbon dioxide every year. I install all of these great energy efficient equipment and technology, and I switch to solar energy, etc., so that I actually haven't used up my full allocation of carbon dioxide emissions in a year. I could then sell those emissions to another company. That company who hasn't figured out a way to stop emitting carbon dioxide could buy my carbon dioxide allocation. So this is, we already have some of this happening. In a steady state economy, we would have to boost that, how that is happening. So step 2, in terms of policies that we would need to see in place, I've already talked about this. We need to stabilize population. Currently, we're already seeing very low population increases in most wealthy countries. A lot of rich countries, though, right now are actually trying to increase and encourage population growth. So in a steady state economy, we have to get to the point where our immigration versus immigration is stabilized, so that here in the United States, we have a stabilized population that doesn't become destabilized through immigration. And in poorer countries, we know that's really where the large population growth is happening right now. So we need to do things that we've already talked about: educate, provide access to birth control, and provide women with equal rights as men. A steady state economy also needs to work towards reducing inequality between males and females, between ethnic groups, between the rich and the poor, etc., etc. Economic growth currently, in our current neoclassical macroeconomics mode, we push and promote economic growth because there's this argument you often hear that the more that our economy grows, the better off the poor will be. This trickle-down effect that we hear a lot of. Well, those of us who live in Kansas know how well the trickle-down effect has worked over the last 5 years. So in a steady state economy, we get rid of that idea that the rich will help the poor naturally and instinctively, and instead there isn't this continuing emphasis on economic growth. There will be a finite amount of economic growth and a finite amount of wealth, and there needs to be explicit controls on wealth. And this is where it gets sticky. particularly in countries like the United States, where we traditionally do not like government control over our wealth. But steady state economists would argue there needs to be a maximum amount of wealth that somebody can hold and a minimum of wealth. So it doesn't mean that everyone's going to hold the same amount, but it does mean that if you make more than a certain amount, that money is not going to be yours and it will get redistributed throughout the economy. Steady state economy also emphasizes reducing the amount of hours that we are working in a day, in a year, in a month, etc. Currently, we live in a society in the United States where we feel like we have to work more in order to make more, and we use that as a, sort of a way to justify the amount that we work. In a steady state economy, we cannot basically continue to just produce more and work more, because that is when we use more resources. So the idea would be to shorten the workday, so we're producing less, working less, and having more leisure time. And this is a model that in other countries is followed a lot. European countries embrace leisure time and vacation time in a way that's very different than we in the United States do. We also talk a lot in steady state economics about reforming our monetary system and our banking system. This is an area that's kind of out of my wheelhouse, but we do know just from paying attention to the news, there's a lot of controversy over how money is made, how banks actually purposefully increase debt to drive economic growth, and that most money is created by private banks in the form of debt. So in a steady state economy, all money would be created and spent, sent out into existence by some type of a public institution. So a centralized government-controlled bank. Banks would not create money. They would have to borrow money if they want to lend money. Very different from our current monetary system. In a steady state economy, we would also change how we measure progress. So currently we're reliant on GDP. We talked last lecture about all the negatives of relying on GDP. In a steady state economy, GDP is not important. We would replace GDP with other forms of accounting. It might be the Human Development Index. It might be another one called the Genuine Progress Indicator. But we would measure well-being, and we would measure how we are doing in environmental terms, social terms, and economic terms. Okay, so that is what a steady state economy is. I am not an economist, so I do my best to sort of clearly communicate all of that. I think the takeaways from this are there's a real conflict between sustainability and our current emphasis on economic growth at all costs. Economic growth is no longer improving people's lives, particularly in the developed world, and we likely need to move into some type of a steady state economy. Whether or not that economy looks exactly like I've just described it or something different, it needs to, we need to have different economic goals than we currently have. The last thing I want to talk about is this concept of degrowth, which I said was an important concept. Degrowth basically is just saying that we currently live in a world where we have really rich countries and really rich people, and really poor countries and really poor people. Those people who are on the bottom or in the poor area, they need economic growth. They need to increase the amount of income and wealth that they have in order to have a quality of life that is equitable to our quality of life. So we need to push them up, and they do need continued economic growth. The people who are in the rich countries and on the rich part of the world, they need to probably go through something called degrowth, where they are where their resources, economic resources, are actually decreased as opposed to continuing to increase. And that redistribution of wealth would then help out poorer people. You can see by me saying that out loud what a difficult argument this is to make with people. And it would be interesting to have a longer term conversation about this if we could meet in class. But I did want you all to be aware of steady state economics. I feel like in our economics classes at university, our economics professors always talk about sort of this mainstream macro classical economic model and don't even make our students aware of the fact that there are other economic models out there, steady state economy being one of them. Thank you.